Have you ever felt like no matter how hard you try, it's never quite enough? You smile when you don't want to. Say yes when every cell in your body is screaming no. Nod along to conversations you don't believe in just to keep the peace. And when you're finally alone, there's this emptiness, a strange, heavy silence that whispers, who are you really beneath it all? You see, most of us were born into an invisible cage, a cage made not of iron or stone, but of expectations. From the moment we took our first breath, tiny invisible threads began weaving around us, the need to be a good child, a good student, a good partner, a successful person. We didn't even notice it happening. It started with a look of approval when we followed the rules, a cold glance when we didn't. And slowly we learned, to be loved, you must be pleasing. But here's the thing nobody told us. This cage moves wherever you go. No matter how far you run, no matter how much you achieve, if you don't wake up to it, you'll carry it to your last breath. And perhaps that's why so many of us feel exhausted, not from life itself, but from pretending to be what we think others want us to be. Buddhist teachings have long spoken of this silent suffering, not with the modern language of anxiety or burnout, but with a wisdom that cuts even deeper. The Buddha taught that much of our unhappiness comes from attachment, not just to possessions, but to images of ourselves, to who we think we're supposed to be in the eyes of others. This craving, this thirst for approval, has a name. In the ancient Pali texts, it's called tanha, a burning desire that fuels endless cycles of dissatisfaction. The more you chase it, the thirstier you become. And here's the trap. No matter how much you please, you can never please everyone. Someone will always misunderstand you. Someone will always criticize. Someone will always want you to be something you're not. And when you realize this, truly realize it not as a concept, but as a felt truth, something remarkable happens. The walls of that invisible cage start to shimmer, to flicker, to loosen. But to get there, we have to dare to look at how deep the conditioning runs. Why do we care so much about what others think? Where did this need for approval begin? And more importantly, what would it feel like to live without it? Imagine waking up one morning and instead of asking, will they like me if I do this? You ask, does this feel true to who I am? Can you picture the lightness of that? The unclenching in your chest? The quiet, steady strength of standing in your own truth? In Zen tradition, they call it no mind, a state where one moves without self-consciousness, acts without seeking applause, lives without the burden of pleasing. It's not rebellion, nor is it apathy. It's clarity. Clarity that your worth is not up for debate, that your life isn't a performance for an audience you'll never truly satisfy. And yet, we cling. Not because we're weak, but because we've been taught to. Because approval tastes sweet in the moment, like a drop of cool water in a desert. But that drop never quenches the thirst. The first step to freedom is not in changing others, but in seeing the bars of your own cage. To notice how many of your choices are made not from inner wisdom, but from fear. Fear of rejection, fear of being alone, fear of not being enough. And that's where this journey begins. Not with grand declarations or overnight transformations, but with a quiet, honest question whispered to yourself. Whose life am I really living? In the teachings of the Buddha, suffering isn't a punishment. It's a signal, a signpost pointing us toward a deeper truth, toward the possibility of liberation not from the world, but from the illusions we've woven around ourselves. And perhaps the greatest illusion is that we need to be loved by everyone to be at peace. You don't. Because the moment you stop chasing approval, you begin to find something far greater, something quieter, something real. A peace not built on conditions, but on knowing who you are beneath the masks. And if you listen closely, in that silence between pretending and pleasing, you might just hear it calling you. It's strange, isn't it? How a single nod, a passing compliment, a fleeting moment of applause can make us feel alive. For a brief instant, it's as though the world recognizes us, affirms our worth, and whispers, "Yes, you matter." But like smoke in the wind, it vanishes. And the next moment we're left chasing the next nod, the next like, the next word of praise, and so the cycle begins. What's most dangerous about this is how invisible it is. We don't often realize how much of our day is spent fishing for approval, a carefully chosen outfit, a crafted caption, a forced smile at a gathering you didn't want to attend, all for what? A momentary hit of validation. In ancient Buddhist texts, this craving for recognition is seen as one of the subtlest forms of attachment. Not attachment to things, but to an image, an identity carefully constructed through the eyes of others. It's a seductive illusion because it works for a while. You get the promotion, the compliment on your appearance, the acknowledgement in the room, and your heart swells thinking, "I've made it." But then it fades, and you're left chasing the next fix. The Buddha spoke of this in the form of upadana, the clinging, the grasping at things that cannot hold. Like trying to catch moonlight in your hands, approval is intoxicating because it promises something it can never deliver, lasting peace. It's built on conditions. People approve of you when you fit their idea of who you should be, when you reflect their values, their desires, their insecurities. And the danger is, you start confusing their version of you for who you truly are. It's no wonder so many people feel lost, because they've spent years becoming a masterpiece painted by other people's brushes. Think about it. How many choices have you made, not because it felt right, but because you wanted to be seen a certain way? The job you took, the relationship you stayed in, the words you left unsaid, all crafted for approval, all in service to an image. And here's the painful irony: no matter how perfect that image, it will eventually crack. People are fickle, their tastes change, their moods shift, and if your peace depends on their applause, you'll be a prisoner forever. Buddhism doesn't demonize approval, it recognizes it as a natural human desire, but it warns us. Never build your home in a place that was only meant to be a passing shelter. Approval is like weather, pleasant when it's here, but foolish to rely on. The wise understand this. They smile when praised, bow humbly, and let it pass. They hear criticism, reflect if there's truth, and let it pass. Because they know, both are simply waves on the surface of a much deeper ocean. When you realize the illusion of approval, something extraordinary happens. You begin to move differently. You speak not to impress, but to express. You choose not to be admired, but to be at peace. You stop performing and start living. It's not about becoming indifferent or cold. It's about valuing your inner alignment more than external applause. The old Zen masters had a saying, "When no one praises me and no one blames me, I am truly free." Can you feel the weight of that freedom? To walk through a crowded world, untouched by its shifting judgments. Because here's a truth many never dare to face: no one's opinion of you is as powerful as the one you hold of yourself. And the opinions of others are nothing more than reflections of their own inner worlds. Their joys, their wounds, their fears. When someone praises you, it reveals what they value. When they judge you, it exposes their insecurities. It was never truly about you. Realizing this isn't arrogance, it's clarity. And clarity, my friend, is the beginning of freedom. The cage we spoke of before, it's built with the bricks of approval and the mortar of fear. And every time you choose truth over applause, authenticity over performance, you loosen another bar. Soon, a light begins to shine through the cracks, and you remember, there was a life before the performance, and there can be a life after. A life not lived to please, but to simply be. And it's there in that silence that the journey starts to feel different, not easier, but lighter, because what awaits ahead isn't the absence of judgment. It's the absence of needing it. And in that space, you'll discover something precious, a different kind of joy, one that doesn't come from applause but from peace. Somewhere along the way, many of us made a silent pact, a vow we didn't even realize we took. If I can just make everyone around me happy, maybe then I'll be safe. Maybe then I'll be loved. It starts small. A polite laugh at a joke you didn't find funny. Agreeing to plans when your body's begging for rest. Saying yes when every fiber of you wants to say no. And like drops of water carving stone, it shapes us. Not through grand betrayals of self, but tiny, everyday abandonments. Until one day you look in the mirror and don't quite recognize the person staring back. Who is this version of me that never upsets, never disappoints, never contradicts? A ghost wearing 1,000 masks, each tailored for the room you're standing in. This is the trap of people-pleasing. On the surface, it seems harmless, even noble. After all, what's wrong with being kind? With wanting others to feel good in your presence? But kindness and people-pleasing, they're not the same thing. Kindness comes from fullness, from a place of inner peace and genuine compassion. People-pleasing, though, it comes from fear. Fear of rejection, fear of conflict, fear that without constant approval, you'll cease to exist in the eyes of others. And like all things rooted in fear, it's a cage disguised as comfort. Buddhist philosophy speaks deeply about attachment to reputation, how clinging to a particular image of ourselves is a subtle but potent form of suffering, because no image can hold the full truth of who you are. When you live to please, you slice yourself into palatable pieces. This part's acceptable, that part's too much. Better hide it. Over time, you become a carefully curated performance. And the tragedy is, even if the world loves the show, you'll still feel empty. Because deep down, you'll know they don't love you. They love the character you're playing. And that realization is devastating. There's a Zen proverb: chase 2 rabbits, catch none. When you chase both your truth and everyone else's approval, you lose both. You become a stranger to yourself and a puppet to the crowd. The cost of people-pleasing isn't just exhaustion, it's identity. You lose sight of your voice, your preferences, your boundaries. You say yes too often, and soon, your no becomes foreign to your own tongue. And here's the harsh truth no one likes to admit. Even with all that effort, you still won't make everyone happy. There will always be someone displeased, someone offended, someone unsatisfied. The Buddha taught that the 8 worldly winds, praise and blame, gain and loss, pleasure and pain, fame and disrepute, blow through every life. No one escapes them. To base your peace on controlling those winds is to anchor your ship in a storm. What's beautiful, though, is that freedom isn't found in changing the winds. It's found in changing how you sail. When you begin to release the compulsion to please, you step into a different kind of strength, a quiet, unshakable clarity. You start asking, what's true for me? What matters to my heart? Not in defiance of others, but in honesty with yourself. It's a radical act in a world that teaches you to conform. And yes, people might pull away. Some will misunderstand. But the ones who remain, they'll love you for the right reasons. Not for the role you played, but for the depth you embody. And perhaps even more importantly, you'll love you. There's a lightness that comes when you stop performing, when you walk into a room and no longer scan for approval, when you make choices not to avoid conflict, but to honor truth. It won't be easy at first, because breaking free from the people-pleasing trap means sitting with the discomfort of disappointing others. But on the other side of that discomfort is peace, a peace that says, I am enough as I am, and those who cannot meet me here were never truly with me anyway. And slowly, you'll discover that the relationships built on honesty, not performance, are the ones worth keeping. The Buddha often spoke of the middle path, not indulgence, not denial, but balance. The same applies here. It's not about becoming selfish or detached. It's about letting your kindness be sincere, not strategic. Letting your generosity come from wholeness, not hunger. When you offer yourself in this way, you'll find that the connections you create are no longer chains, but bridges. And one by one, the masks you've worn will fall away, until at last you meet the world bare-faced and unafraid. And it is here, in the soft, steady quiet of your own truth, that something remarkable happens. You no longer need to chase love, because you realize you've carried it within you all along. There comes a moment, after chasing approval and wearing 1,000 masks, when you finally stop and ask yourself, is this the life I was meant to live? Not the life designed to impress. Not the one carefully arranged to avoid conflict. not the one shaped by the unspoken rules of other people's expectations, but your life. And in that quiet, aching question lies the doorway to freedom. Yet for many of us, the pendulum swings wildly. When we finally recognize the exhaustion of people-pleasing, we often rebel. We swing to the other extreme, cutting people off, rejecting feedback, claiming we no longer care what anyone thinks. But here's the thing, trading one extreme for another isn't freedom. It's just a different kind of cage. The Buddha spoke often about the middle way, a path between indulgence and denial, between attachment and aversion. It's not a lukewarm compromise or a timid balancing act. It's a fierce, compassionate clarity. It's the ability to stand in your truth without the need to crush others with it, to honor your voice without silencing theirs. Because life isn't black and white, and neither are we. Authenticity isn't about doing whatever you want, whenever you want, consequences be damned. It's about aligning your actions with your values. It's about learning to speak your truth with kindness, to hold your boundaries with grace. It's knowing when to yield and when to stand firm, and it requires wisdom. In Buddhist philosophy, there's a concept called upya, skillful means. It's the idea that the truth isn't a blunt instrument to be hurled at people, but a medicine to be offered skillfully, with compassion and awareness. Some situations call for directness, others call for silence, and wisdom is knowing the difference. When you begin to live this way, something beautiful happens. You stop measuring your worth by external applause, and you stop isolating yourself in defiance of it. You realize that authenticity isn't a performance, it's a practice. It's waking up every day and asking, what feels true for me today? What serves the greater good without betraying myself? It's understanding that your truth may evolve, and that's not weakness, it's growth. The middle way invites us to hold both our individuality and our interconnectedness. Because while your voice matters, so does theirs. And while your needs deserve tending, so do the needs of the world around you. This isn't about perfection. It's about presence. It's about moving through life like a skilled sailor, adjusting your sails, reading the winds, staying centered amidst the storm. And the irony is, when you stop chasing approval or rejecting it, you find peace. A peace that isn't dependent on whether others cheer or criticize. A peace rooted in knowing you're showing up as fully yourself, with open hands and an open heart. There's a line from an old Zen teaching, when walking, just walk. When sitting, just sit. Above all, don't wobble. The middle way is about not wobbling, not teetering between people-pleasing and reckless defiance, but walking your path with steady, mindful steps. And when you falter, as you inevitably will, you don't shame yourself. You gently return to center. You remind yourself that this isn't a performance, it's a practice. And every moment is a new chance to choose differently, to pause, to listen, to act from wisdom rather than impulse. In time, you'll notice the chains of expectation grow lighter, not because the world changes, but because your relationship to it does. You realize you were never meant to please everyone, nor were you meant to harden your heart against them. You were meant to live honestly, humbly, and whole. And from that place, you no longer need the world's permission to be yourself. There's a strength in this middle ground, a quiet power in knowing who you are and loving others without losing yourself. And as you begin to walk this path, you'll notice something extraordinary. The relationships that remain deepen, the ones built on illusion fall away, and what's left is real. If you look deeply into a single leaf, you'll see the entire universe. That's not poetry. It's a truth that quietly shapes the very fabric of our lives. For most of us, we move through the world trapped in a single, persistent illusion, the belief that we are separate. Separate from each other, separate from the earth beneath our feet, separate from the silent sky above. And it's in that imagined separation that our suffering begins. We become obsessed with how we appear to others, as if their opinions could somehow validate our existence. We twist ourselves into smaller and smaller shapes, desperate to be accepted, terrified of rejection. But here's what we rarely see: there is no other. In the wisdom of Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh, there's a term, interbeing. It means everything is connected. Nothing exists independently. You can't separate the sunlight from the flower, or the cloud from the rain, or you from the countless lives, choices, and conditions that made this very moment possible. You are not an isolated self. You are a wave in the great ocean of existence, and when you realize that, something profound happens. The need to endlessly please others begins to dissolve, because you see, at last, that their approval and your worth were never truly separate. You were never alone in the first place. The face of the stranger you pass on the street holds your own reflection. The kindness you offer returns to you in ways you may never see. And even the harsh words, the disapproval you fear so deeply, they too are born from someone else's pain. A pain that, if you look closely, you've carried too. We are not solitary stars scattered across a cold sky. We are constellations, each point of light connected, forming stories older than memory. This truth doesn't mean you lose yourself in others. It means you find yourself through them, not by chasing validation, but by recognizing the thread of shared humanity that runs through every single being. When someone disapproves of you, it's not always about you. Sometimes it's about their own unmet needs, their own unresolved fears. And when you see this, really see it, compassion rises naturally, not as a performance, but as an undeniable response of the heart. You begin to release the tight grip of needing to be liked, not out of defiance, but from understanding. Because if everything is connected, then harming yourself to please another is harming the whole. And standing in your truth, kindly and clearly, is a gift to the entire web of life. There's a story from the Buddha's time. A man insulted him in public, hurling angry words like stones. The Buddha listened silently, then asked the man, "If someone offers you a gift and you refuse it, to whom does the gift belong?" The man, confused, replied, "To the one who offered it." "Then," said the Buddha, "I refuse your anger. It remains yours." In this simple teaching lies a key to freedom. You cannot control how others see you, but you can choose whether to carry their projections as your burden. Interbeing reminds us that while we're all connected, we are not responsible for the unhealed pain others may direct at us. We are responsible for how we respond. When you move through life with this awareness, you start noticing the invisible threads between people. You see how a kind word ripples outward, how a quiet act of courage inspires someone you may never meet. And in those moments, the need to people-please feels so small, because your worth isn't measured in fleeting approval. It's woven into the very fabric of existence. The air you breathe, the ground you walk upon, the stories passed through generations of ancestors whose survival made you possible. You don't have to audition for belonging. You already belong. And when you finally lay down the exhausting task of trying to be everything for everyone, you become something far more powerful. Yourself. A self that understands its interconnectedness. A self that no longer needs to beg for worthiness. A self that can see through the eyes of others without losing sight of its own. And it is from this space, this knowing of interbeing, that we step into a deeper kind of freedom. One not built on isolation or rebellion, but on belonging. A belonging that requires no permission. As you walk this path, you'll find moments when old fears resurface, when the urge to please returns like a familiar ghost. And that's okay. Just remember the leaf, the sky, the wave. Remember that you are not alone. You are never alone. And in seeing this, you'll learn to live not from the small, anxious self, but from the boundless, quiet strength of your true nature. There's a moment when you stop chasing approval, when the world feels lighter. It's as if the weight you've carried for years slips quietly from your shoulders, not because you fought it, not because you forced it away, but because you simply stopped holding on. And it's here in this quiet spaciousness that another ancient wisdom reveals itself. A wisdom spoken of in both Taoism and Zen, Wu Wei. Translated simply, it means non-action. But don't be mistaken. Wu Wei isn't about doing nothing. It's about doing without force, without striving, without the tight grip of ego that says, I must control this or else. It is the art of effortless action. Consider water. It doesn't struggle to flow. It doesn't insist on bending the riverbank to its will. It moves naturally, yielding where it must, strong where it needs to be. And in doing so, it shapes mountains, carves canyons, nourishes forests. Without anxiety, without approval. When you live by Wu Wei, you begin to act from a place of alignment, not performance. Your actions are not driven by the desperate need to be seen or liked, but by the quiet clarity of what feels true and right in that moment. It means speaking when words are needed, and falling silent when they are not. It means choosing kindness not to be admired, but because it rises naturally from your being. It means letting go of the exhausting urge to micromanage every outcome, and instead, learning to trust the current of life itself. This doesn't make you passive, it makes you wise. In the same way a skilled archer releases the arrow, knowing that once it leaves the bow, its flight belongs to the wind. You give your best not for applause, but because it's the integrity of your heart. And then, you release. The philosopher Lao Tzu said, when nothing is done, nothing is left undone. This paradox holds a profound freedom. It means the less you interfere, the more life aligns itself. The less you grasp, the more space you leave for unexpected grace. When you stop trying to manage every perception of you, people sense something different. Not aloofness, but presence. Not carelessness, but calm. And the approval you once chased begins, ironically, to arrive without effort. But by then, it no longer owns you. You'll notice it, perhaps even appreciate it, but it won't define you. Because you've come to understand that your worth was never something to be bartered for affection. It was always here. In the effortless way your breath moves in and out. In the unforced kindness that radiates when you're not performing. Wu Wei teaches us that sometimes the most powerful action is to step aside, to let the river carry what it must, to trust that your life is part of a larger, invisible order. And when fear rises, as it will, you can meet it not with resistance, but with the gentle awareness that you are not in control, and you never needed to be. You are a note in a vast symphony, a wave in an ancient ocean, a spark in an endless sky. Your task isn't to direct the music, it's to move in harmony with it. And in doing so, you'll discover that life unfolds with a strange kind of elegance when you stop forcing, stop pleasing, and start simply being. It's here in the effortless, natural flow that the deepest freedom waits. Not the freedom to escape life, but to move through it with grace. To be firm when needed, gentle when called for, and quiet when silence is wisdom. This is not a technique to master. It's a remembering of what you've always known. A return to the way of water, to the stillness beneath all striving. And from this stillness, you begin to see that every moment offers a choice. To grasp or to let go, to force or to flow, to please or to simply be. And as you move through this world, no longer chained by the need for approval, you'll find something extraordinary. Life, it turns out, was never against you. It was waiting for you to stop struggling, to lay down your armor, to move effortlessly, to live as naturally as breath itself. Music softens into a single, sustained note like a deep, eternal breath. And it is from this quiet power that we now move toward the closing wisdom of this journey. A final reflection on what it means to live free, not by pleasing, not by proving, but by remembering who you've always been. Here we stand, at the edge of a journey that has unfolded not just as words, but as an invitation to step out from behind the masks and mirrors, to shed the invisible cage built from the need to please others, to awaken to a freedom so profound, it vibrates deep within every breath. This freedom, the freedom of authentic living, is not about rebellion or defiance, nor is it the reckless throwing away of care or kindness. It is a gentle, steadfast courage. The courage to be who you are fully, openly, without apology. It's the quiet knowing that your worth isn't measured by nods of approval, likes on a screen, or even the loudest applause. It's measured by the simple truth of your presence. When you live authentically, you invite others to do the same. You become a beacon, not because you demand it, but because you embody it. You show that it's possible to walk this world free from the exhausting treadmill of people-pleasing. And in this freedom, you find peace. Peace not of silence alone, but peace born from truth, from a heart uncluttered by masks, from a spirit aligned with its own rhythm. Remember, living authentically doesn't mean you won't face challenges or difficult emotions. It means you meet them with clarity and compassion. You no longer bend yourself into shapes that don't fit. You no longer dim your light to avoid shadows. Instead, you shine fully, imperfectly, beautifully. As Thich Nhat Hanh beautifully said, because you are alive, everything is possible. And it is precisely this possibility that awaits when you let go of the need to please everyone. So, if this message resonates with you, if you feel even a flicker of that quiet liberation, I invite you to join this growing community. Share your thoughts, your struggles, your victories, because in connection we find strength. In shared stories we find healing. And together we remind each other of the power in simply being ourselves. Thank you for walking this path with me. If you found value here, please like, subscribe, and ring the bell, so we can continue exploring these truths together. Your presence here matters. And remember, your freedom begins the moment you stop trying to please everyone.